Thanks very much, Jamie, and thanks, folks, for joining. I'm delighted to be able to spend a bit of time with you to share some thoughts around doing more with less. I'm going to try and keep it practical, plain English as best I can, and ultimately immediately usable for you and your organisations. The webinar is completely about protecting the impact of your organisations by freeing up capacity. It is not about making indiscriminate cost cutting. That's not what I'm going to talk about at all. In fact, the complete opposite. So hopefully it'll give you something you can walk away with and something that will really benefit your organisations. So whilst you're reading this slide, this is a little bit more about me and about Delta D and what we do. I want to start with asking you a question. Hopefully you've got your chat windows up. Just interested, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the top, how efficient do you think your organisation is today? No right or wrong answers, just your take on it, just to give me a sense of where we are with things. And just while we're waiting for that to come through, Delta D as an organisation, it is about helping other organisations. It's why I set the business up, why I founded the business in the way that I did. We specifically focus on things that relate to driving business excellence, and we've got a very value-based approach to that with the organisations that we work with. Equally, I structured the business to enable us to do these sort of things, recognising that the not-for-profit sector doesn't necessarily have the funds to pay for things, and you'll be interested to hear, hopefully, some at the end. You will hear some free offers for me to try and help you as businesses move forward even further. I'm right in saying, hopefully, Jane, that a copy of the slides, as well as obviously the recording, can be made available to everybody, including those people that weren't able to attend. So you don't really need to take notes if you just prefer to listen, but feel free to do it in whichever way works best for you. So we've got a few answers coming in, and as you might expect, there's some sort of lower end, there's some mid end, and there's some upper end, and it's also interesting, a couple of things about Anastasia, you saying you don't have enough of a view, and that's perfectly fine, because it is a hard question to answer, but the reality is no one's sitting here going, I'm a 5. So that means that there's an opportunity for all of you, as much as anything, just to find out about how efficient you are, even if it's not to dial that upwards. So hopefully I've got good company here, and I can leave you with some stuff that's going to be really helpful for you. In terms of the flow, we're going to spend about 20 minutes talking about operational efficiency, and then a key part of making efficiencies is managing change. So we'll go into that and try and make sure that I spend a bit of time talking to you about how do you make that stick. And as Jamie said, we will have time at the end for Q&A. So feel free, if something jumps to mind, stick it in the chat. I might cover it as I go along, or equally, I'll try and pick it up at the end. But there'll also be an opportunity for you to just ask any random questions that you might have. And once we've had the Q&A, then I'll talk about those free offers. Okay, so my take on things at the moment is efficiency matters more now than it ever has, for a few reasons. I think it's fair to say that the world continues to present, and has presented, a large number of challenges on a global scale over the last 10 years, whether that's Brexit, USA and China trade wars. Obviously, COVID was incredibly impactful for everybody. Global supply chain crisis that came off the back of that, then the global inflation surge, obviously things like the war in Ukraine and USA and Iran, they're all having big impacts, both in terms of energy price surges, and unfortunately, I think we're in a situation where there's a lot of geopolitical fragmentation, and that means that we're going to continue to get quite random impacts from things that happen around the globe. And one of the other aspects that I think is touching everyone's lives at the moment is the boom of AI. Automation and AI has been around for a long time, but its accessibility is, it's on everyone's phone, it's in everyone's homes. It's such a huge challenge, but also an opportunity. Unfortunately, this all means that the world has not been in a great state for the last 10 years, and the trend looks likely to continue with those global shocks. So trying to navigate those global impacts means that efficiency is super important. Businesses of all walks of life are facing rising costs, increasing demands and funding pressures, regardless of how you're structured. And I am absolutely sure that feels very acute to those of you working in the charity sector. So our objective today is to give you some things that hopefully will enable you to protect the impact that your charities can make by doing a little bit more, hopefully by spending less, or certainly no more. And my belief is if we can achieve that, that gives you an opportunity to protect your mission, which is so super important. There's a lot of, certainly around social care, but regardless of what your charity does, the need is super high at the moment. And I think it's important that we protect your ability to deliver those services. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about costs generally. It's fair to say that the traditional customer loyalty concept, I think, is under huge pressure, and that idea is limited. So faced with rising costs, subscription fatigue, constant economic uncertainty, customers are becoming increasingly transactional, and their buying behaviour is following that line, which leads people to switching suppliers more readily in search of perceived better value rather than remaining loyal to a brand. Now, I'm not blaming customers for doing that. They're doing it for a reason. But at the same time, businesses are across multiple sectors have adopted a silent price rise approach. So they are increasing prices incrementally, potentially reducing service levels and or adding charges or shrinking product value without making those changes highly visible. So because of the lack of loyalty perceived by these businesses, they're driving costs down and they're driving value down. So it's a bit of a race to the bottom. And a great example of that, albeit there are other reasons why this might exist, but if you look at chocolate bars over the last few years, so most people enjoy them to a fashion, but the size of them has got smaller. Now, they'll tell you it's because they're trying to protect our health, but they haven't reduced the price of it. So the value of the product is shrinking. The price has not changed. In fact, in certain circumstances, that price is just going up. So as a consumer, you're not getting what you used to get for your money and nowhere near that. Mobile phones, another really good example where, because of the way they're regulated, they can charge above inflation every year or at the end of your contract term. And if you're not looking at that stuff, it's very difficult to see a way out from those silent price rises. So those tactics may protect short-term margins for those businesses, but they often erode trust and they weaken the long-term customer relationships. So in this era where alternatives are just a few clicks away, transparency, genuine value and consistently delivering on customer expectations are becoming really important, much more so than what would be traditional loyalty programs or marketing promises. Many of the costs exist in your businesses, though, because they've not been reviewed. They've been allowed to creep. So my first suggestion is encouraging you to review those historical decisions, look at those contracts and spend lines, just to really make sure that those costs are visible to you. And that gives you then an opportunity to question and to save. So I think that's a really, really important one. It's just so easy to let these things roll. And it's important to review them all. An example of that is around utilities and facilities. So utilities contracts or facility-based contracts and supplies, they're often easy wins for near enough any business. So if you're checking your contracts and looking at your usage, especially on tariff-based contracts, that is super important. Incorrect tariffs will drive non-value add costs without a doubt. An example of that would be data on mobile. So you might buy a lot of data, so that's part of their tariff structure. Do you need that volume of data? Typically these days it's unlimited calls and unlimited text. So data is the marginal change, and large volumes of data can be very expensive, especially if you're doing things abroad as well. You know, roaming charges, albeit that there are moves to get rid of them, they still exist. So it's really important to get that right. If you were thinking about electricity, lots of businesses are on straight tariffs, almost as like you are at home. Sometimes a more complex tariff basket can be really good for you. So being able to review those sort of contracts is really important. Now, I recognise this could be a tricky area if you don't know what you're doing. So I've put a couple of pictures on here, and they are in the deck. You're going to get it blown up so you can read them a bit better. But I've worked with a company called Auditel, and they provide quite a lot of support to the charity sector, and they will help with an audit of contracts. Typically, it doesn't cost anything. It's only if you then take them up to actually broker for you will it cost you anything. So if you're interested in this area, I'm more than happy to put you in touch with my contact, a guy called Paul Copsey, and let you have a conversation with him. So I think they would be really helpful, especially for those of you that are not too clear on what you can do and how you can do it. One of the things that there's been a lot of noise about historically has been sustainability, and the suggestion that it comes as a premium. And I'm really glad to say that that is not always the case now. You can find greener tariffs that will give you a benefit. Equally, obviously, if you're reducing your consumption, you reduce the risk of the price impacts. But I think the sustainability for lots of people now also provides a stronger funding narrative. So if you can demonstrate, and whether that's through a net zero approach or something different, if you can demonstrate the sustainability aspect of your business, like I say, whether that's through the tariff that you use or the fact that you're committing to reducing consumption or whatever lens you apply to it, it does lower risk, gives you that stronger funding narrative. And often these tariffs, especially for charities, can actually come at a slightly better cost than a standard business rate. So certainly one to consider, and sort of push that assumption of premium to the side, and have a good look at that as well. And then let's talk a little bit about procurement generally and suppliers, sort of leaning on the fact that those supplier relationships are under pressure, but there are still some, I suppose, relationship-based suppliers out there that really do believe in their long-standing relationships, and or certainly for the charitable sector, believe in your missions. So it's not to say they've completely gone, and it's certainly worth leveraging, looking for charity discounts and helping with environmental credentials. There is definitely a growing opportunity in our consumption-based society around recycled or reconditioned equipment. And this is something that I think could be especially useful. IT equipment, mobiles, office equipment. There's a lot of businesses now that are servicing people with effectively reconditioned, or potentially they haven't even need to recondition it because it was in very good condition when they received it. And these items are probably just below top spec. So lots of people now buy the new top spec, but actually for a lot of what we do, you don't need that. And that's really important to be aware of. So looking for those suppliers that will offer those reconditioned and recycled units could be a really big saving. And because they're arguably secondhand, you can imagine that you're talking 20-30% reduction probably to start with, possibly even more so. So they can be a really good way to re-kit out when some of the devices have got broken or old and not fit for purpose anymore. Some real practical levers there for you to lean on, hopefully. One of my particular pet hates is around software. it's just so easy to buy, whether it's a knowledge-based subscription or a license-based software. The ease at which you can purchase that, I mean, it has never been easier. A few clicks, you're into a free trial, you get a discounted price. It all sounds fantastic, but when those contracts renew, do you remember they're going to renew? And they typically come with a renewal with a price increase, so you get that hidden silent price rise again. So going through a subscription and license audit really does quickly surface some of that waste. So just asking, some real simple questions about the products that you've got. Do you actually need them? Do you know why you have them? Have you got the right volume of licenses, or has the number of people or the requirements changed? Is the level of licensing correct? So often these products might have tiered licensing. So if you've got everyone on a top tier, potentially that's not what you need. And just making sure that you've got a review process at least in line with the contract renewals. You don't necessarily have to do it super regularly. Often, if you just do it before the contract renewal, you'll get a benefit when that contract renewal comes up. Hopefully, the worst case scenario is you'll be able to suppress any of those cost rises. So try and maintain your cost envelope as best you can. So that, for me, and I've seen this in businesses I've worked at, you really can drive quite a lot of value and cost reduction out of these things without literally any impact on anybody. So just trying to give you that sort of takeaways from what I've just been talking about. Always do a review before you stop something. Don't just cut it. Make sure you understand what's going to change and what the impacts are. But doing the review is super important. Question your assumptions. Make sure your decisions are now current, not historic. It's very easy to make a historic decision. It was right at the time, but over time it becomes less relevant. So bringing those decisions up to current status often will illuminate opportunities. And a part of this is around small wins. I'm not suggesting that you're going to dramatically slash your operating cost by 10, 20%. But if you can get a number of small wins going, the volume and the time-based value of that will start to add up. And percentage points improvements in operating costs are normally easy to go after. So don't be too worried about how small a saving it is. And I'll give you a really good example of that. I personally use Virgin Media at home. I have done for years. I have to argue with them about my contract every time. They show no loyalty to me. They always put the price up. I ring them and tell them I'm leaving, and I normally manage to get a really good deal out of them. So for the 15 minutes conversation, to me, it's worth the probably £100 or £200 per annum that I'm saving myself to have that. And if you start to do that with everybody, you potentially at least suppress the ongoing inflationary cost rises, if not actually give yourself a better outcome. So when you're making those sort of changes, all we've got to make sure is that they stick. And that sort of leads us into managing change. Before I leave, just going to quickly check. Right, there's no questions in the chat, so I'm going to continue to move on. Some of what I've been talking about, you might think, well, we don't need to worry about managing that change. We can just do it and everyone will be happy. That may be the case, but I want to give you a little bit of a rundown of how you might consider managing change without making it really complex. We could spend days talking about change management. It's a continually evolving topic as the world shifts and the way that people want to be engaged shifts. Personally find it really interesting. It's a big part of what I do in the business and the services that I provide to customers. But for today, just going to keep it really simple, really practical, and something that you can easily implement without getting into any particular theories. People often talk about resistance to change in some guise when things get difficult. And I'm just going to try and help you reframe that, because ultimately, any resistance is normal. What often we perceive as a resistance to change, it's people protecting the mission. It's people that are fearing losing something. It could be a concern about, the capacity for change, or the complexity and the multi-stakeholders involved. So there's a genuine concern which normally underpins that perceived resistance. So I think the first thing, whenever you're making a change, is to acknowledge the fact that there will be people in your organisation that will want to protect the mission. They will have some fear about what's changing. They will see capacity constraints, and they may be concerned about the stakeholder complexity. But if you acknowledge that potential and do that before you ask people to shift and change, you're going to have a greater chance of getting the change, A, to go well, and then B, to stick. So not reacting to that resistance, but being inquisitive about it, I think, is really important. There are lots of different ways of categorising change. I'm just going to keep it simple with two. Let's talk about, in a world where everything needs to be quick, people often focus on processing technology, and they treat everything as simple change. And the reality is that when you add people into that mix, it's not as simple as you think, and you've probably all had experience of that. And so it is a bad idea to try and dumb everything down to simple and quick, because sometimes it really isn't. And if you approach it on that basis, you probably will generate resistance because you probably just crack on with stuff and don't really engage people or give people what they need to know. So when you're assessing change, you just got to classify it. And I've just given, there's two lenses here. It's either really simple or it's more complex. And all I'm trying to do here is get you to think about the level of engagement. So the practical rule that I'd ask you to consider is when you're trying to do something that you deem to be a little bit more complex, so maybe it's changing systems or making teams work differently in their processes day to day, or maybe even shifting the culture, or even a massive one would be, I guess, shifting the mission of the charity. Those are significantly more complex. They're going to require more engagement. There's going to require more ownership from within the organisation, and they're likely going to need a bit of time. And those things all increase as the complexity rises. So please don't underestimate the people part of any change. Even if you think it's a really simple change of a system, you can still create a level of complexity. So engagement is so important to do it, but also to try and get it right. So to try and help you get it right, like I say, there are many change models out there, and I'm just trying to make this a simple, practical tool for you. You've got to start with being clear. What is it? What's the problem you're trying to solve? What is it you're trying to achieve? If you're not really clear on that, potentially you're making changes in a more experimental way, which might be the right thing to do. But again, you need to explain that to people that you are making experimental changes, because you don't know what it's going to do. So there is still a problem to solve, or there's still an objective, but you at least explain the why you're doing it in a particular way. But typically there's a very clear outcome or a very clear problem. So being clear about that is so important, because that enables you to then think about, well, who's going to make the decisions about this change, and who's actually going to do the delivery, not necessarily the same people. So when you've got that clarity of ownership, and you know who's going to move the barriers out of the way and who's going to actually deliver whatever the changes are, it makes it a lot easier to get the engagement right. Once you've got those two parts, you can then start to think about how you're going to communicate to people. So who needs to know what and by when? And it may sound really, really obvious, but it is something that often isn't done. It's often a cursory glance at who needs to communicate, an email, a briefing, and there's no actual real engagement. It's just a tell rather than an engagement. So getting that communication right with a little bit of planning, you'll get a much better outcome, I can assure you. And I think another little rule of thumb is plan what you're going to do and then do more, because you probably haven't planned everything you should do, and you're probably never going to get it right, and also probably never going to do enough. So I always say, if you think this is 10, dial it up to 11, and you're going to get a better outcome. And the other part of this is momentum. Most people love a win. So even if it's really small, it doesn't matter. It really does generate, that little success generates buy-in, it generates momentum, and it generates benefits for you. So even, if you're getting a £10 saving today rather than a £100 saving in 2 or 3 months, that's worth having. So actually trying to make change small and incremental, and it's not a thing that's done a lot today. And people love the big jazzy, here's the big change that we're making, isn't it amazing? Yes, those are sometimes necessary, but for most businesses, that's not what they can do. They haven't got the capacity for that or the funds to do it that way. So small incremental change and almost getting a cultural approach to it is really, really important. And as you build that momentum, people will join the club. They will want to be involved, and they will, add, if you like, to the opportunity. So just to do a little bit of a deeper dive into these aspects. So when we're talking about clarity and ownership, to me, they're a prerequisite of success. If you don't have this, how do you know when you've got there? And how do you know who's doing the work? So, you're leaving it to chance in my book. That driving of accountability, from my experience, shows that you are more likely to get to an endpoint. Whether it's where you wanted to get to, that's a different thing, but you're likely to get to an endpoint. Whereas if there isn't, these things just drift and probably don't ever get to an endpoint. So it's really important to get that clarity and the ownership right, and then you're off to a good start. If you can do that, you genuinely will be off to a good start. When it comes to communication, silence creates resistance. Absolutely does. People will make up their own stories of what's going on, and sometimes those stories are really, really creative because someone's grabbed something and all of a sudden they've run away with it. So if you say nothing, you are going to create resistance, highly likely. It's really important to work out who's going to be impacted by the change and then work out what they need. Now, it might be as simple as an explanation. It could be some consultation. It could actually be some full-blown engagement, make them part of the change. It could be just a little bit of information. Alongside that, for some people, it's how do they ask questions about it? So what's the route? If they're not sure about something, they're concerned, how do they ask questions? Giving people an ability to ask questions will normally suppress a large volume of resistance. And then the other part of this is about how do they raise their ideas? And this is part of that momentum build. As you're building that momentum, all of a sudden the ideas start to get generated, and that can then turn it into almost an improvement flywheel. You're just really spinning up the opportunities and getting more and more from your employees and from your volunteers. It is, without a doubt, easier to adapt from a planned approach than it is to react to a resistance or a problem. So doing some planning would always be my advice. Take that time. It doesn't normally take long, but take that time at the start of a change and then evolve your communication as you get feedback from people. Just keep the comms up. So as the change progresses, keep that communication going, show progress. Even if the progress is slower, don't be afraid of that. Don't see that as a failure. Sometimes things happen, but making progress is still good news. So trying to build that buy-in and momentum, as I've already said, and just really getting into some form of review cadence. So you look at how are we doing, what have we succeeded in, and just continue to add that into the momentum mix. And people will want to join that party, they'll want to get involved, and you will eventually create so much momentum in your improvement flywheel that it will almost be self-sustaining. So just to sort of get towards the end of the talk and a bit of reflection on what I've been saying. Hopefully, and if you just look through this slide, hopefully there is just one thing that you could take away and do something immediately, or one of the concepts that I've talked about has triggered something that's much more relevant in your world. So find that one thing. find somebody that's going to own that, both in terms of the accountability for making any decisions around the change, but also the delivery. So, you need to find somebody that's going to own these changes, and you need to set a realistic deadline. There is no point saying to people it needs to be done tomorrow, because that just says that there's been no plan, there's been no thought. So you've got to consider that capacity for change, the people that you want to be involved, the level of communication before you set those deadlines. But if you do that and you actually start to talk about those small wins and build that momentum, you will get much, much more from your organisation, and you will then enable yourselves to do hopefully more with a little bit less. So I'm going to start sort of on the right hand side of this. So all my contact details and the business contact details are there. The first offers are completely and utterly free. So I run a LinkedIn newsletter, but for most of you, I would suggest the Delta D Deep Dive newsletter is much better. The sorts of stuff I've been talking about today is what I talk about in those newsletters. So they both come out monthly, sometimes a bit more regularly if I think there's something particularly interesting, but that will land in your inbox completely and utterly free. So when you get hopefully the PDF of this, then obviously you should be able to click on that link. If there are any problems, by all means, contact me either on LinkedIn or by email, and I will help you out there. So that's number one. But the main offer, and I mentioned earlier on around how I've structured Delta D and the desire to support the not-for-profit sector. So I'm a licensed practitioner for insights discovery, which is a fantastic self-awareness and team effectiveness tool. So I can offer free sessions for charities through Insights Foundations. So Insights is a global brand, and they have their main company, but they also have a charitable foundation. Those sessions will give you effectively a personal profile, which talks about your preferences, how you like to operate. I had this in a business I was working in. That's how I came across it a couple of years ago. And it made a real difference to me, but it made more of a difference to us as a leadership team at the time, but also as a business. So not only do you get that profile, but I will work with you and deliver a one-day team workshop to explore those preferences, but more importantly, trying to help you understand how you can harness that in your teams. And that ultimately will, if you commit to it, it will create more effective teams and it will give you better outcomes. I'm absolutely sure of that. So the offer is that for the 3 charities on a first come, first served basis that come back to me and say that's something that you're interested in, I will go through with Insights Foundation to check your availability and check the validity of the request. So if you want me to start that dialogue with you, just get in contact. But as I said earlier on, the newsletters are completely and utterly free. You can sign up to those directly. I think I'd just like to finish off. We've got a nice few minutes left. Just saying, really appreciate you coming along and listening. But I think more importantly, I really do hope you get something out of this. You've got my contact details, and I'm more than willing to come and talk to you in your setting, in your setup. If you want to explore things with me, you please do get in touch. But I guess my last thing will be to say, really good luck with your improvements, and I hope you do get more out of less.